We can get started with our main content now. So I'd like to welcome Dr. John Barentine. Here he is. There we go. Sharing today about the State of the Science report of artificial light at night for DarkSky International. John has been involved, I don't know for how long, with DarkSky, currently as principal consultant for DarkSky Consulting. He has previously held leadership roles at DarkSky International and helped the organization grow in dramatic ways. He's helped shape lighting policies worldwide, working to provide expert guidance on dark sky conservation, outdoor lighting strategies, and sky quality assessments. With a PhD in astronomy and long career spanning telescope operations, research, writing, and international advocacy, Dr. Barentine continues to champion science-based approaches to preserving our nighttime skies. And John, thanks so much again for sharing your wisdom and doing all the research for us. I look forward to learning a lot today. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that lovely introduction. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I see many familiar faces and names in the list, which is always reassuring. And as usual, your interest in this is something that helps ensure that it's a priority for the organization and that we have, very scientifically sound arguments that we make as part of our advocacy. So with that, I will go ahead and start my screen share. And what we're going to do is as we've done before in the past, we've got some poll questions for you that we're going to go to immediately. So let me put that slide up, and I'm going to briefly hand it back to Chris to run the poll, and then we'll get into the substance.
That's right, folks. It's time for you to play along at home. Go ahead and answer those questions that popped up on your screen. We're just really looking to know, how long have you been an advocate for DarkSky? And the two middle questions, we're looking for, how confident do you feel discussing these topics? And that's the first, number two. And number three is, which one do you feel the least informed about? And that last question, are you an early bird? Are you a night owl? Are you something in between? Let us know in the chat. I know Betty and Maya had a strong opinion about that answer. So we'll get going. We'll make sure we get a lot of people to answer, probably end this at about 70 to 80%. I see a lot of the responses in. Amazing. Thank you very much. And just a brief reminder as we go, if anybody does have a question for John or for DarkSky, please do put it in the chat or use the Q&A portion of your screen. We will have a full Q&A portion after our main content. All right, those poll participants are clicking in. It's wonderful to see. Just a few more seconds and we'll end it out. That's a word I'll have to Google. All right, let's end the poll. I'll share out these results quick just so everybody can know who we're hanging out with. It's wonderful to see. We have some newcomers, the kind of like a median poll, about 3 to 5 years, with some 10 to 20, 21 plus. That's amazing. As far as the topics we feel confident about, ecological, maybe a little bit of energy, least confident with light and social justice. That lines up, public safety, human health. So we're in the right place. Well, I know we're learning a lot today, and just almost an even split, early bird, night owls. No wonder we all care about the night. We are up all the time. So John, thanks for that. Hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. All right, I've got about, I hope about 40 minutes of presentation for you, and the rest will open up to Q&A, and I can stick around past the top of the hour if you want to keep talking about any of this. If you have attended one of these events before in the last couple of years, a lot of this will look familiar. I know that some people are fairly well informed about the report, but every year we have people who are new and who don't know much about it. So bear with me, and I'm going to go through some of the common material that we talk about each year in terms of what this report is, why we need it. I will tell you about how it was composed. What sources did we draw from in order to produce this? I'll show you how the report is structured, which then leads into a discussion of how you can use it in your advocacy. And in the last section, I'm going to give you what I think are the most important research advances in 2024, and end with some of what I believe to be the most important open questions, the things that we hope that the research community will put some attention on in the future. So let's start off with what the report is. So the report concerns itself with artificial light at night. Probably you know what this is or have at least a sense of what it is based on your affiliation with DarkSky and the fact that you're here today. I do want to briefly define this, though, or give some boundaries to it to say not only what it is, but what it is not. If you hear me use the word ALAN, A-L-A-N, that's an abbreviation for artificial light at night, which is largely what its name suggests. It is artificial in the sense that it is caused by humans. This is light in the nighttime environment that does not have a natural origin. It is light, although we confine ourselves in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum, mainly to the part of the spectrum that humans are sensitive to. So the visible wavelengths of light. There is some concern about pollution in the near infrared and the near ultraviolet parts of the spectrum, although there's a lot less research into that. It is important, however, because it does have an effect on wildlife in particular. We're not sensitive to those wavelengths, but other species are. And of course, this is happening at night. So to contrast it from any sources of light in the daytime environment. We further break it down along two lines, and there's overlap in this, but I want to make this distinction because it's important. There's an outdoor context to ALAN, and there's an indoor context. So that is suggested by the two images at right. Mostly what the report concerns itself with is artificial light at night in outdoor spaces. So there's a picture of the New York City skyline to suggest that. But in particular, where human health is concerned, we also have to talk a little bit about light at night in indoor contexts. And the person staring at the blue computer screen, probably far late into the night, like a lot of us do, is meant to suggest that. And I'll explain what that means. Just know that mostly the research results that I'll be talking about have to do with the outdoor space, but there is some overlap with the indoor space as well. The report is, in essence, as concise an overview that we can make of the best of what we know about the effects of all of this artificial light at night in our world over these 7 broad topical areas. And we've added lately this notion of satellites to the mix. So there's a bit more than what we originally started with when the report was first published in 2022, as DarkSky has become aware of and interested in the effect of satellites on the night sky. So that is now something that is part of the report every year. So we've grouped the research results across multiple disciplines into these broad categories, and the report runs through them one at a time and explains what the evidence is in each of these areas. It's a high-level overview of the latest science related to artificial light at night. We don't have the luxury of getting into a great deal of detail, but it's also something that's not meant to be aimed at specialists. It's not even necessarily something that is directed at scientists, although we think scientists will find the report valuable. It's really meant for the public, it's meant for the advocates and a general audience. We back up this compendium of scientific results with our sources, which is very important for purposes of credibility. We give some interpretation to those results. So it's not just a list of the scientific facts as we think they are established in the scientific literature, but also an attempt to arrange the information, to distill it, to find what the consensus view is on the topics of the report. And we also focus a bit on what are the important unsolved problems and directions for future research so we can continue moving this subject forward. Why is this report needed? Why do we go through this every year? Well, fundamentally, light pollution advocacy touches on scientific topics. It has a technical dimension to it that is unavoidable. And that means that we need to become at least sufficiently versed in that factual material to come across as properly informed when we talk about light pollution and artificial light at night. But we also want to make very clear, strong, fact-based representations about light pollution. But we also, at the same time, need to state very clearly what are the limits of our knowledge, what are the shortcomings in our current understanding of the issue, and that's a part of the report as well. And all the way along, we cite our sources. If we want to be seen as credible in our arguments, if we want DarkSky International to be seen as the trusted source of reliable information, then we need to make very clear where we get that information from, and how we pulled it together in order to communicate this information most effectively and reliably. We want that information to be accessible, we want it to be timely, and we need it to be accurate to the best possible extent. And what I mean by that is, again, we need to be clear on what is fairly well understood versus the areas where we don't know quite as much. We don't want to overstate our case relative to what the facts can tell us. The good news is that there is a strong factual basis for a lot of the arguments that you all are already making in your advocacy. This is an attempt to help back up those arguments with all of that properly cited factual information. But we also need that to be useful. If we wrote a report that was aimed at scientists and used their language and their jargon, it would be less accessible to people, and it wouldn't be really useful for advocacy. So we're trying to condense and distill down this wide body of scientific results into the most important points and put them into accessible language, to the extent that when this text is composed and updated each year, we run it against readability tools in order to try to make the language as understandable to the widest cross-section of members of the public as possible, avoiding technical terms wherever we can, and putting it into words that people can appreciate and understand. So that's something that's very important to us in making this report every year. How did we compose it? Beginning in 2022 with the first edition of the report, and then in the subsequent annual updates that we have made to it. So the core source of our information is something that's called the Artificial Light at Night Research Literature Database, which is a very long phrase. And so we abbreviate that by calling it ALLEN-DB, Allen Database. This is a publicly accessible resource that you can get to off of the darksky.org website. It is curated by scientists. I saw Chris Kaiva's name in the attendees. I have to give a major shout out to Chris, who is not only one of the most important researchers in the world on this topic, but is also one of the co-curators and has been there with me on this project since the very beginning. We use a platform called Zotero, which is an open source web-based platform for managing bibliographies, managing lists of references. It's widely used in academia, and we collectively search the literature. We look for new papers in all kinds of journals, and we take that information and archive it in this platform, which is then in turn, again, publicly accessible. And it's searchable, more importantly. So if you're looking for something that we don't necessarily talk about in detail in the report, I urge you to take a look at the database because it is the world's single most comprehensive source of this information. We're at over 5,000 references now, going back to antiquity. I think the earliest paper or reference in the database is from about the 1st century CE. So people have been thinking about this topic for a long time. But as you'll see in a moment, the bulk of the content is relatively new. Here's what the interface looks like. If you go to that web address, you'll see a screen that looks very similar to this. Each reference that we put in the database has an associated record. You can click on these lines here in the main window, and it will take you to the full record with the full bibliographic information. So we're looking to make sure that every reference clearly indicates, where it's from, when it was published, what are the author names, how can you find it on the web. In almost every case, there is a link that will take you to the source material wherever it is archived on the web. We put a series of tags, which are kind of like keywords, on each reference. These are the little colored dots that you can see. So we've arranged them by a list of about 15 top level keywords and then many more detailed keywords below that. So if you want to see just all the papers on ecology, for example, or you want to see all the papers on sky glow, if you click on that down in that box in the lower left, it will then filter the results to just show you those papers. And if you're looking for something specific, you're looking for a phrase and a title, if you're looking for an author name, there's a search box in the upper right. Put your search string in there, and it will then filter the results. It's a fantastic resource. Again, we're over 5,000 articles, and it is growing strongly. I pulled from the database a list of the total number of papers at the end of each year based on the year that those papers were published. And I'm showing you this as a graph. So on the vertical axis, this is the cumulative number of papers in the database. So the total of for all time up to the publication year, which is running across the lower axis. And in particular, I want to highlight the last about 7 or 8 years where the growth in research output has just gone through the roof. We're looking at nearly 15% growth in the total number of papers from all time in the database in each of the last 8 years, and it shows no sign of slowing down. That's an important indicator that there is more interest than ever in these topics, and we're going to continue to see, I think, a lot of interesting and high quality work published in years to come. This is a breakdown of the sources in the database for the publication year 2024. That comes to about 554 published items. And these are those broad topical areas that I showed you before. So this pie chart indicates roughly how many papers there are in each of the topical areas that were considered when we composed this year's update. And continuing a trend that we have seen over at least the last decade, the main topics of these papers are wildlife, then this topic called remote sensing, which has to do with using satellites and balloons and drones and other kinds of remote platforms to measure light pollution and the applications of that measurement. And then human health is something that is very popular as a topic. And that's human health is it's specifically about Allen. So studies that have something to do with measuring the effects on people. You can see the way it breaks down with the other topics. Satellites has grown since we have added it, but this overall distribution of topical material has stayed pretty stable over the last few years. We prefer in all cases sources that are independently peer-reviewed, and particularly those that appear in what we judge to be reputable scientific journals. Sometimes that's a little bit difficult to judge. We're not experts in all of the sources of literature around the world. Chris and I have fairly frequent interactions where we're debating whether or not to add a paper depending on these criteria. We're fairly conservative about it, but in some cases, we don't have much information about a particular topic, and all we might have are some white papers, for example, that don't get an external review. We tend to put in student theses, master's and doctoral theses, because sometimes that information doesn't appear elsewhere in the literature. But we think about things like the reputability of the source, the rates at which papers are cited, which is an indication of how they are viewed in the scientific community. And again, in all cases, we try to get a full bibliographic record for each paper that's added to the database, knowing that the intent here is that this will stand the test of time, and that hopefully many years after a paper is published, we can still go locate it. We can see how things are faring in that sense. So our analysis piece, since we have this source of information, so what do we do with it? Our analysis looks at common themes. What are the threads that the different papers within a particular topical area have in common? What are they all talking about? What are the conclusions that they are reaching in common and that are shared across these various sources? So we pull all of that together. And then we had to think about how to present it. And that falls back again on this notion of trying to write a plain language narrative text that summarizes these research findings. And we do that in a series of short factual statements with these source citations, so that when you back up and you look at the entire report, you can see how the subjects interact with each other. You can see what common conclusions that they are drawing. And that's what's moving this broad field forward over time. So now I'll tell you a bit about how the report is structured, which will lead into suggestions for how you can use it in your advocacy. So when I point out these features, what I'll do is I'll show you some actual excerpts from the report, and I'll talk about the pieces of it. So on the title page, right after title, DarkSky International, there is a thing called a digital object identifier, or DOI. That same code appears in the footer on the other pages of the report. And what a DOI is a kind of a code that is unique to this published unit. So this string of letters and numbers is uniquely associated with not only this document, but this version, the 2025 edition. So each year we get a new identifier assigned to the document that is intended to be a permanent identifier that goes with the record no matter what happens in the future. So even if things move around on the web, if you have this DOI number code, you should be able to find the report in essence for all times. So it's important that it get that identifier. On the first page in the upper left, there is a one-page summary of the entire document that lays out its structure. You can see those numbers that are in colored boxes. This is a screenshot of the PDF version, and the colored boxes indicate that those are hyperlinks. So if you click on that, it will take you somewhere. If you click on the hyperlink that's in cyan for the DOI, it will take you to where the report is on the web. If you click on one of the red boxes, it will take you to that section of the report. Similarly, throughout the document, you will see numbers in green boxes. Those are the references that we cite in a bibliography at the end of the document. If you click on that, it will take you to that page of the document. Below that one paragraph summary, there is a brief introductory paragraph that summarizes the substance of the entire report. The paragraph above it is more about the structure of the report, but the introduction is the highest level distillation of the science in as few sentences as we can possibly make. And it's not only about what the science is telling us, but it's also, there's something in it about the nature of our advocacy itself. That last sentence, the main challenge identified by scientific research is how to maximize the human benefits of artificial light at night while limiting the potentially negative social and environmental impacts. That's, I think, ultimately what we're all interested in. Each of the major topics that I showed you on a slide earlier has its own numbered section. There are subsections with titles as well. And then there are, for each of those major sections, there is a brief summary in about between 1 and maybe 3 sentences that's in italic face and is outlined with a little hairline running around that block of text as a box. So if you wanted to summarize the whole report on, say, a page in each of these topical areas, you could take these headlines and you could condense them onto a page, and you would have a very good high-level summary that's a little more detailed than that introductory paragraph. And then lastly, for this slide, wherever possible, without being too excessive, but we've added illustrations that make certain points of the text clearer and make it more interesting to look at. So as I mentioned, we have in-text referencing. Those are the numbers that are surrounded by green boxes in the PDF version. Each time we cite a source for a piece of information, each of those numbers refers to a specific source, which is in that bibliography at the end of the document, and they are in a running numerical order. So if you know that number, you can go to the list at the end, and you can get the reference that connects to that particular fact. And then the final section of the report, the last numbered section, it's called Knowledge Gaps and Research Needs. We get into what we think are the interesting open questions, where there are shortcomings in our knowledge about these topics, where there's a need for more research over time. And we've tried to phrase those as actual questions that we'd like to know the answers to, that we hope will be the drivers for research in coming years. The final section is that long reference list that I mentioned. There's the full text of each source with the numbers. There is a brief paragraph just before that that talks about the methodology by which the report was composed, how we did it. It links to some of those sources, including the Artificial Light at Night Research Literature Database. And then there's a running footer on all of the pages that has that digital object identifier number, again, has a link to darksky.org and has a page number. So now I want to talk a little bit about how I think you can use this report in your advocacy based on knowing, why we did it and what does it contain and how it is structured. So again, that introductory paragraph on the first page is a really, I think it's a good, concise summary statement about light pollution, what we know about it, and what the goals of our advocacy are. This is, in essence, I think, something like a brief elevator pitch. If you were talking to somebody and you only had a few seconds to communicate ideas, there's a lot of information right here that would be useful for that purpose. So if nothing else, if somebody who picks this up reads nothing else in the report, they already get a lot of information just by reading this introductory paragraph. Again, those headlines, those boxed summaries for each of the numerical sections with the major topics, if they were taken together, would summarize the report in a page, something that you could give to somebody who's in a decision-making capacity, for example, and without having to get into the details of the scientific research, they would know what the major conclusions are in each of the topical areas. So those have a utility unto themselves. How you can use it specifically to take these pieces is adapt them as you see fit for use in your own communications. The headlines, for example, form a set of talking points that you could put into letters to the editor, letters to politicians, the presentations that you give for the community. You can take any of the text information in the report and reuse it in any way that you like, provided that you give credit to DarkSky International as the source of that information. The one thing that we cannot give you permission to reproduce on your own are the figures, because mostly those are copyrighted and they belong to other people. We've gotten permission from the owners to use them in the report where those are copyrighted. There are a few sources of images that we use that are in the public domain, and we note that in their captions. You can reproduce the entire report with the captions complete and produce as many copies of that as you like. We have permission to do that. If you want to use some of the images that are under copyright, we encourage you to contact the copyright owners to seek permission to reproduce them. We are issuing the report under a Creative Commons license that spells out all of the do's and don'ts with respect to the ways to use the material. An idea for what you could use it for in its entirety, for example, is as what they refer to in the world of policymaking as a so-called leave behind. And what that is let's say you go and you have a meeting with your town council, or you have a meeting with your member of parliament, wherever you're at in the world, and you talk about the issues that matter to you. You talk about light pollution and what your DarkSky chapter is doing, for example. And at the end, you say, if you want more factual information about this topic, if you want to understand what the science has to say about it, you slide this report across the table. Here is more information. In working with legislative staff over the years, I find that they really love that sort of communication because it becomes an option to them. They can look at it if and when they need it. They can read it at their leisure. They don't have to do anything with it right there in the moment. It is supplementary. And if they have questions, they can come back to you. They can go to DarkSky International. They can contact me, and we can talk about getting answers to their questions. But it's a really good way to back up the in-person advocacy that you might do. You could send this to decision makers either electronically or in hard copy, and then put it on their plate and let them decide what they can do with the information that it contains. So in the last few minutes before we go into the Q&A, I want to talk about some of the items that I think are the real highlights from the research that was published last year across these different topical areas and explain why I think it's important and just draw your attention to it. And then I'll end with a few of those important open questions, at least as I see it. So first of all, one of the things that we know from research that's been published over several years is that artificial light at night is increasing around the world. There's some really important work has been published by Chris Kaiba, Fabio Falchi, and others. This is in a paper that's kind of a review that was published by my colleague Hector Linares Arroyo last year, that it contains a lot of information about how we measure artificial light at night, looks at some of the trends, like in this figure that's taken from their paper, that merges together two sources of satellite information about Allen with measurements that go back almost 35 years. All of those kind of cyan colored points are from a satellite system that was run by the US Department of Defense called the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program. It was mostly about making daytime observations for weather forecasting purposes, but they had sensors that were sufficiently sensitive that they could see light on the night side of our planet. So for each year during that time from 1992 to 2012, what the picture is showing you is on the vertical axis, it's showing you the amount of light that the sensor received, and it puts it on a relative scale. So it took the number in 1992 when the program began publicly releasing information. That's the dot to the furthest lower left there. They call that 1 unit, and all of the other measurements are relative to that. So you can see over the next roughly 20 years, there was a fairly steady rise in the total amount of artificial light at night that the satellite was seeing when measured all over the world. This doesn't get down into the level of in different parts or different regions, but this is the total global number. And then there was a brief period of overlap for a couple of years after the United States launched a satellite with an instrument that has a very long name associated, but it's abbreviated VIIRS, or we call that VIIRS for short. And those are the orange points. And in this paper, they only looked at the first few years of the VIIRS results. But as you can see, there's a pretty good overlap with the DMSP results in the first couple of years. And then the United States stopped supplying data publicly from the DMSP program, which is why the cyan colored point suddenly stopped. There's a little bit of overlap. We can see the continuation of the trend here, the apparent flattening of that trend in the last few years, where those 3 points are about the same. If you project this a little bit further into the future, it starts to rise again. So what we can determine from this is that Allen is still growing worldwide. It's an increasingly important environmental influence. Chris and others did some follow-up work that matched this to observations made from the ground to show that maybe the satellites aren't capturing the full story, and that the rate of change is even higher than we thought of in the past. So it's really driving more urgency to this issue, and that's an example of something that's very useful to have the data to support. We saw last year the publication of the first completely self-consistent model of the polarization of light in the night sky. And what polarization refers to is the way that the light waves are sort of wiggling as they move through space. And a polarized beam of light has a preferred direction that it oscillates in space. Whereas there's a corresponding kind of light called unpolarized light that can oscillate in any particular direction. That might seem like a fairly niche technical concern, but the reason that this matters is that a lot of species, some of which are active at night, have some sensitivity to polarized light, mainly because in the daytime sky, there's a lot of polarized light. The atmosphere does a really good job at polarizing sunlight. And some insect species, for example, have evolved the ability to sense polarized light so as to help them orient in space while they move about during the day. To the extent that they are also active at night, they can sense the polarization state of light, which can happen as the result of, for example, light reflecting off of a surface of water, like a still lake or a pond, can polarize an artificial light source that then becomes potentially attractive to insects that are very tuned to that polarization. What I'm showing you here is a paper by Miroslav Kosopaj and coworkers that was published last year, showing a model that they made from physics to describe the polarization of the night sky. They start in that first row, the top two views. This is all of the sky compressed onto a flat surface. So you've taken this sort of dome or bowl of the sky and you've rendered it like it's a flat map. That first level just shows the brightness of the night sky in their model on the right and actual measurements on the left. Then they show you in the next panel in the middle the degree to which that light is polarized as those numbers go from the darker shades up to that gray and then almost a yellow color. That means that the light is increasingly polarized. It's only moving in one direction through space. And then the third row shows you how that direction is oriented in terms of an angle on the sky. And there's pretty good agreement between the model and the data here. So this represents an important step forward so that now we can predict what the polarization of light in the night sky might be. And we think that the ecologists will be interested in knowing that in order to better determine what the impacts are to wildlife. Human health is a great concern to the public. There's more attention to this in terms of how ALAN affects it. And one of the advances that we saw last year is that there's a lot more research being published now that uses actual exposure measurements rather than guessing at what those exposures might be based on sources like satellite data. There's a lot of information in the scientific literature about how we think artificial light at night affects human health and well-being and how it connects up to incidences of human disease. But in many cases, we're taking those satellite indications of light at night and we're matching it up to the incidences of those human health conditions and trying to draw conclusions from that, whereas we don't necessarily know how much light are people actually getting, knowing again that much of that exposure is happening in indoor spaces. This is the result of some work that was published by Windred and collaborators last year, looking at a cohort of 88,000 human participants in a study who all wore little light sensors for a period of time that measured the light they were actually receiving, much of which was coming from indoor spaces. But some of that was also coming from the outdoors through windows at night. And what they found is that people who got more light exposure during the middle of the night, when conditions naturally are most dark, they were most likely to die from any cause at 8 years after the study began, compared to people who did not get light exposure during that time. So that in these graphs over on the left, you notice that in many of them, there's a bump in the middle of the graph, which corresponds to periods of time between roughly midnight and 8 a.m. local time when most people are asleep, presumably in darkness. But they found that people who got light exposure at those times had the greatest risk of developing medical conditions that would cause early mortality. So that was an important advance. Similarly, here's an example of a Chinese study that looked at specifically the amount of light people were receiving in sleeping rooms, like bedrooms at night. So they placed light meters inside the rooms of volunteers in this study to measure their light exposure. And then they drew blood from them to look for markers of inflammation. We know that there's a lot of human disease and adverse outcomes that result from high levels of inflammation. And there is some theory that says that repeat exposure to artificial light at night during the overnight hours, especially when people are normally asleep, can increase inflammation, which the theory says then leads to all of these adverse health outcomes. And they found indeed that people who slept in rooms with higher ambient room lighting had higher levels of these inflammation markers in their blood. And that held up even when they controlled for other kinds of influences that might result in these elevated levels of inflammation. So it really adds some evidence to this theory that says that light exposure at night, even in controlled conditions indoors, is really not great for human beings. Increasingly, biologists and ecologists are finding that when we do lighting design well, it reduces the impact of that lighting to wildlife in outdoor spaces. I wanted to show you this result that came from work done by Avalon Owens and her coworkers that directly shows the impact that DarkSky International is having with things like the 5 principles of responsible outdoor lighting, which they cited in a figure in their paper by matching up to the ways that they know from looking at a wide amount of research. Lighting affects insect species in particular. Why do we care about impacts to insects? Many of those insects pollinate our food crops, and we have no technological way of replacing the services that they perform for us. So to the extent that insect populations are virtually collapsing right now in large parts of the world, this is a very worrisome development. The researchers are trying to understand what dimensions of lighting design are most effective in reducing the attraction of insects to these light sources and drawing them away from their pollinating duties. So I like this as a way of matching up what we know about the insect impacts to the lighting principles that we think have the best chance of reducing those effects. And when they make those changes based on the 5 principles, as this group in Germany did, looking at lighting in parks in certain German cities, they find that confining the light to the surfaces where it's needed and reducing its intensity and making its color better so as to be less attractive to insects really does have the desired effect. They saw significant reductions in insects being drawn off of their routes. They found better insect diversity in the verges, in the grass, in the forest, off the edges of the lit paths here. And it all came down to better lighting design. So now we have a better connection between doing that design well with respect to the 5 principles and also being able to show that it has this better effect on ecology as a result. So where do we go next? What are some of the key open questions? This is just a subset of the questions that we ask in the report, but I want to leave you with this sense that there are some really big questions that we need to take on, and we hope that the scientific community will look into these questions. And I pulled out a few of these in particular. You know, what kinds of policies are effective at reducing light pollution? Can we put some evidence behind that? Right now, we tend to go on perceptions or anecdotes, but we need some real data to go along with that. How is all of this ALAN in our nighttime environment interacting with pressures like climate change, with loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity to yield even more pressure on the affected species? I showed you some examples now of where the health researchers are beginning to directly measure light exposures. Can we separate out the sources of light from indoors versus outdoors and say with more certainty, what are those outdoor sources of light doing potentially to our health? What can we find out from lighting design research, which is often hard to get funded and to carry out in ways that are consistent and correct? What are the minimum safe amounts of light that we can put into the environment, keep people safe, but also reduce the impacts, like the study in Germany showing the improvement on the insect populations? And then about the satellites, I didn't really talk too much about that, but there are concerns about what's happening as orbital space around the Earth is filling up with satellites and the potential that that has to change the night sky. You know, where are there limits to that? You know, is there a carrying capacity for orbit? That's something that's really an open question right now. So this is just a taste of those big questions that we, again, hope that the community is going to take on in years to come. So that's my pre-prepared material. Here is a link to where you can get the report. You can also scan this code with your mobile device. I'll leave this slide up for a moment. I would love to hear from anybody who has questions about the report, comments about it. Here are the different ways that you can get in contact with me. I thank you for your attention today, and I'm glad to take your questions.
Thanks very much, John. We'll leave your contact information up for just a second so folks can grab it down if they'd like to before we start our Q&A time. And folks, if you do have any questions for John or for about the state of the science for DarkSky, please do feel free to put them into the chat. Use the Q&A portion of your screen. We're collecting the questions as they come in, and if we can't get to it, we can follow up with you offline. So let me go ahead and stop your sharing and get back to it. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us again today. If you missed parts of our chat or John's presentation, excuse me, and want to check it out, feel free to follow us on our YouTube channel that will be available there shortly, and check out State of the Science on darksky.org. Now, John, I was very interested to learn that the database records go all the way back to the 1st century. You gave me my new little fun fact tidbit for the next decade, I guarantee it. So I thank you for that. We had a question from Armando Fernandez, just curious, specific to the Allen database or the Artificial Light at Night database. Are there many of the research papers available, freely available, or do they have to buy licenses to look at some of the research?
Well, Armando, that's a great question. And the answer to that is, unfortunately, many of them are behind paywalls. That said, it is very often the case, if you contact the authors of the paper, and in almost all cases, they will give you at least an email address. If you write them an email and ask them to send you a copy, almost inevitably, they will do exactly that. So if there's something you really want to read that you cannot otherwise get to, I encourage you to contact the authors and see if they will send it to you, because there is actually a pretty good track record of scientists trying to help people out, and they're pretty responsive to those questions. Yeah, great question.
Nice. Great question. Here's another one from Henrik, and we think light pollution related to safety and traffic should be discussed more. Are there any studies you happen to know about, or and more coming along from the database?
Yeah, Henrik. And I noticed that Paul Marchant is on this call, and I know Paul has a paper coming out about this very soon to be on the lookout for, that has to do with tens of thousands of streetlights in Leeds, in the city in the UK where he lives. He's one of the researchers on this who's done a lot of great work. There are others. The issue of how lighting interacts with traffic safety is reasonably well defined. There's a good amount of evidence that when you add light in what are known as conflict zones, where you have traffic from different directions coming together, there's no doubt that that improves safety and it saves lives. There is much less evidence to suggest that lighting stretches of roads that have relatively low traffic density, so at times of the night when there are just not a lot of cars, or in cases where the speed limit is relatively low, there's just not a lot of evidence to support that contention that it somehow is better for traffic safety to use light. Rather, instead, there's more evidence that the lighting on cars, their headlights, are much more efficient at detecting objects in the roadway than continuous overhead lighting is. And one of the things that we learned about that in concert with vision scientists is that contrast is very important for visibility. So if you continuously light a stretch of road, especially at a level that is higher than the light that car headlights provide, there's a decrease in contrast that can actually work the other way around and make it harder to see objects in the road. So we really want to take advantage of what we've learned from vision science. And the results are somewhat mixed. It really depends, again, on the context. Are we talking about small villages where you have low traffic density, low speed limits? Are we talking about major highways at rush hour where we have a lot of cars and they're near each other, where there might be more of an advantage to having that overhead lighting? But even if you do, obviously, as the traffic level falls off during the overnight hours, what the science is telling us again is that there's not really a good justification for leaving that light on at full power all the time. Dim that light down, shift its color to lower color temperatures when there's less of a need for the high color rendition during those overnight hours. So even in cases where there's a good connection between the use of light for traffic safety and improving conditions on the roads, oftentimes there are ways that are scientifically sound that we could lower the light level, reduce or even eliminate the light during the overnight hours, as some of the studies have tried in places like the UK. They found that there weren't really adverse consequences to doing so. There's a couple of paragraphs in the report about traffic safety. Definitely have a look at that.
Great. Thanks, John. You mentioned there were some gaps outlined in the report in different sections. Would you mind sharing one that's particularly top of mind? And you'd mentioned we want to encourage the community to fill those gaps. How do we actually get that done?
How do we get that done? If I had to pick one thing that I think is most consequential, and this is in part because it is of most concern, I think, to the public, to policymakers, et cetera, it's really that health question. There's a lot of concern as to whether, particularly the outdoor light sources, is that a concern for human health and well-being? Again, given that so much of our exposure comes from indoor spaces. Years ago, while he was still living, I talked to Richard Stevens, who was one of the premier light and health researchers in the world. His group in the 80s established the connection between light at night exposure and disruption of the circadian rhythm that they observed in nurses who worked in hospitals during the overnight hours. And they noticed that there was a strong correlation between that occupation and the incidence of breast cancer in women. And that was the beginning of the hypothesis that light was affecting the circadian rhythm, that circadian rhythm disruption was leading to conditions like cancers. That has borne out with more research, mainly in the indoor contexts. And I asked him what he thought about outdoor lighting. And he said, I can tell you what happens to people when they do this shift work, or if they, are exposed to room lighting conditions all night long, that sort of thing. But he said, I can't tell you what happens to somebody who has a very low level of light in their sleeping room that might be coming from a street light outside their window, but they're exposed to that level of light every night for years or decades. He said, we just don't have any idea what that does to human biology. So to the extent where there might be those situations where, even though people spend the majority of their time in indoor spaces at night, that they might be getting light exposure from distinctly outdoor sources, and that might have a health consequence. I think that's an urgent question that really needs to be addressed. What stands in the way of that is it's fundamentally it's lack of funding to do a lot of these studies, especially in the climate we're in right now. But also, light pollution research tends to be very interdisciplinary. And people, if they want to become researchers in that realm, they still largely have to go establish a research reputation in slightly more well-known or mainstream areas within their branch of science. And then they can start to kind of feel their way out and do this more interesting off-the-wall light pollution research to convince funding agencies to provide the resources, because the funding agencies don't know what to do with it. They don't know what subject it's housed in, since it doesn't yet have a complete identity of its own, even though we've argued that it should. And we need to give younger researchers the confidence that there's a future for them in science in this subject, and that it is coming into its own as a topic. But these are still big challenges for us, and I hope that we'll continue to make progress on those fronts in the future.
For sure. Wonderful. And you before had mentioned that there are some college thesis or university thesis in the database as well. And our learners and educators could get on this as well, right?
Yes, 100%. We have a conference series that meets every other year that's called Artificial Light at Night. The last meeting was in Canada in 2023. We had something like 120 or 130 attendees, and of those, about 1/3 were students. And that really gives me a good feeling about where this is going in the future.
Nice. That's great to hear. So folks, we'll go for just a few more minutes, a few more questions, and I appreciate you sticking along with us, and we will open up for networking just after this. So John, we had another question come up. This is a great report, but it is in English. How can we handle translation? Should advocates just kind of reach out to us? We can talk.
Absolutely. If anybody wants to take on the task of doing a translation, I encourage you to do so. Again, you're free to do that because of the way we've licensed the text. We worked with a couple of years ago with DarkSky Switzerland that provided a human translation into German. I would love to make foreign language translations available in languages other than English. And if anybody wants to help out with that, we welcome that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I just shared the engagement at darksky.org email in the chat. We can start that conversation, get folks connected. Wonderful. So I think we'll just take one more because I'll give you a good one. Public safety and security, oftentimes the biggest obstacle to change. How can we encourage more scientists to do more studies and maybe arrive at a solution to all those conflicting conclusions as to what we seem to have now? How would you speak to that?
That I think might have more to do with the state of research in criminology, for example, generally, how we study the instances of crime, what fuels that, what can influence how it proceeds. And of course, there's a lot of interest in that. Everybody wants to live in a safe community. And ideally, we should try to test out the policies that are backed by evidence. The reason that it is so difficult, I think, to do good crime studies involving light at night is that there are very many variables involved, and it's hard to constrain those all to where we can really tease out just the effect of light. And we point this out in the studies, is that a lot of the crime studies in particular are not very well what we would call controlled. They don't account for the things that are not related to lighting that might produce the results people are seeing. And it is all over the place. There are studies that say there's a very clear connection. There are studies that find that there's no connection at all. It might be the case that there is just no single formula that relates crime and lighting. That it might depend so much on the local circumstances that we cannot develop a predictive theory. The more data we have, the more studies that people do, obviously the better, and might help us make this situation less muddled. But I think we're still a long way from having a definitive answer to that question, if we ever get one. And I know that is frustrating, because we would love to be able to say clearly and definitively what that relationship is, but there is the possibility that we just never get there.
Sure. And we just had a great comment from Paul Marchant, criminologists and rather poor statisticians, in his honest opinion.
Yes, read Paul's paper called "Why Lighting Claims May Well Be Wrong." I think it's excellent.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, John. And actually, by just a special guest, we have Chris Kaiba that wants to make just a brief announcement about a paper coming out. So Chris, feel free wherever you are.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, everybody, I normally wouldn't mention it, but there's a paper coming out on Monday that I think is particularly relevant for advocates. And it will be in the journal Nature Cities. I posted the link there. So on Monday morning, or say Monday lunchtime Europe, take a look there. I think it will be exciting for a lot of you. So please take a look.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And thanks again, John, for sharing your wisdom and all the information with us today. And that will conclude the formal part of our Advocate Action meeting today. Thanks, everybody, again, for joining. If you do need more information about Say the Science, check out darksky.org. Feel free to reach out to us if you do need any information or to get your questions answered.